I'm going to end it there and turn it over to my good colleague Nart Villeneuve from the Citizen Lab, who's going to talk about some more details about the methodology and some of the unique patterns we found in the filtering before Rob gets into some of the results. So Nart?
So we tested in about 40 countries / regions, and for us that's actually on the technical side a little bit more difficult because we actually tested over 120 internet service providers in total. And what we do is we test for approximately a week, connecting to these websites using our testing tools, and our goal is to identify and test for a consistent filtering behavior. So the sites that we count as blocked are sites that were 100% inaccessible during that testing period. One of the limitations that's brought up is sites that are only temporarily inaccessible or temporarily blocked. In this study, what we did was we counted any site that was accessible during that time frame as accessible. After conducting our tests, all the anomalous results are investigated further through network metrics, but often manually, to ensure that what we're seeing is actually intentional blocking so we can differentiate it from possible errors. One of the observations that we noticed is that there were some instances of considerable variation across internet service providers, but in other cases there was quite an outstanding uniformity across quite a number of internet service providers. Often this corresponds to regimes that implement a centralized form of filtering. So at central locations, the filtering takes place and all the internet service providers have to pass through those gateways, in which case you expect uniformity amongst the ISPs. Whereas in some countries, filtering responsibility is just delegated to the internet service providers, and they choose the means and methods for what to block. Sometimes they even choose what to block, or are given only vague instructions and interpret that and try to figure out what websites certain topic areas would correspond to. But sometimes we see that internet service providers, even though they're using different technology and vague instructions, actually block quite a bit of the exact same amount of content. One really interesting case was in Myanmar, or Burma. There's 2 state-owned internet service providers, but one filtered a lot more than the other, which was quite interesting for us. One focused solely on sites that had the word Burma in the domain name, and opposition groups and dissident groups and so forth, while the other extended it to cover more social areas like pornography and dating and so forth. Another interesting case was in the United Arab Emirates, where the main internet service provider filters fairly heavily, while one special internet service provider that services the Dubai Dubai Free Zone was completely unfiltered. There wasn't any filtering at all. So it's a case where there's a country with 2 completely different levels of internet access. Another interesting case for us was Uzbekistan, where we actually tested 5 internet service providers, and there was very high uniformity among them. Whereas last year when we tested, we found that some internet service providers didn't filter at all. So sometime over that year, they really focused on getting all of the internet service providers to block the same kind of content. And another interesting case was South Korea, where despite different blocking behavior between the 2 main internet service providers, they pretty much blocked the exact same content. The techniques that were used for filtering varied quite a bit. The most common was IP blocking. This involves configuring routers, and in some cases, countries that have proxy systems, they can configure the proxies to block IPs as well. But blocking IPs in the routers is usually the first way that countries new to filtering start blocking, because it's something that is fairly simple to do. The internet service providers don't need to buy any new equipment, and it's pretty effective. You're just blocking all of the content on that host. But the problem is that when you block a single IP address, you block all of the websites that are hosted on that content. So it leads to considerable overblocking. So some countries that were pretty new to filtering that blocked by IP were countries such as Ethiopia and Libya, where they just blocked a few IPs. But a really good example is actually Pakistan, where they block IPs at the International Gateway Exchange. So IP blocking affects all of the ISPs that route through that exchange. And they decided to block some blogs on Blogspot. And Pakistan is an interesting case because the ISPs leaked the blocking lists. So this is one of the few cases where we actually know what they wanted to block, as opposed to testing large amounts of URLs, trying to figure out what content areas they're targeting. We actually know what they were targeting. And in the case of Blogspot, there was a couple of blogs that were hosting cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that they wanted to block. But they blocked the IP for Blogspot, so they blocked the whole thing, all of the blogs on Blogspot. And actually this kind of backfired against them because now there's a big movement in Pakistan against internet censorship of people who were not political in the first place, but just wanted to update their blogs. The other technique that we see is DNS tampering. So once there's some pushback coming from users and advocacy organizations talking about the fact that all of this content that was never intended to be blocked in the first place is being blocked, they try to look at other easy ways or simple ways to just target the content that they want. And what they generally do is configure the DNS servers not to resolve particular domain names to the proper IP address. So in that case, for example, they could block an individual Blogspot blog or an individual domain as opposed to all of the domains on a single IP. And I've seen up to tens of thousands of domain names hosted on one single IP address. One really interesting case was one ISP in South Korea, which resolved the domain names for pro-North Korean sites to a police website that informed you that you were accessing illegal content and then displayed your IP address to you and said, by the way, we know who you are. It was a rather intimidating page. And the other interesting thing that we saw in Pakistan is that there's actually overlapping layers of filtering. So although they were blocking the IP address of Blogspot at the gateway level, some of the individual ISPs were also tampering with DNS, and they weren't resolving it to a valid IP address. And one possible explanation for this is that when the ISPs can demonstrate that they can competently block the content the government wants them to block, perhaps they'll remove the IP blocking at the gateway level. The other method that we see is URL filtering. That's generally countries that use a proxy-based or commercial filtering system to block URLs. Generally, they just block the root URL, the domain, with the path of a slash. But sometimes they'll block a full long path URL. In Saudi Arabia, for example, the main pages of the Arab Human Rights Information Network are accessible, but the specific Saudi pages are blocked. Another interesting use of that kind of blocking are countries like United Arab Emirates and Syria, which block all websites that end in .il, or the Israeli ccTLD, all of them. In these countries, unlike countries that block by IP address, users are usually given a block page, or a page that tells you that you've been intentionally blocked. Sometimes the block page even tells you how they've categorized the website. So sometimes you can differentiate between websites that are blocked because they appear on a commercial filtering list and websites that have been added by the local ISP or government. Often there's a user-defined category or some kind of local category that tips you off that it's not a result of smart filters blocking, but it's a result of an intentional URL added to a list. And the other issue about using the commercial filtering software is that these companies often make mistakes. So content that was never intended to be blocked in the first place by these countries gets blocked for all of their citizens because of a classification error made by a commercial filtering company. The other thing that we see is that keywords in HTTP headers, or the information sent by your browser to a web server, can be filtered. Usually, this is done to target search engines. So when you search for the word sex, for example, in Yemen, you won't get any results, you'll get a block page. Because when you search in Google, that word gets appended to the URL path in the browser, and that triggers the filtering. But the most interesting case of keyword filtering actually is in China, where their keyword filtering is actually bidirectional. So you can trigger it with requests into China, and you can trigger it from requests out of China. And what they do is, if a keyword appears in the HTTP header, so in the URL path or in the host header, which sends the domain name, they send you back a reset packet and a reset packet to the host you're trying to access, and that severs your connection to that website. And as a corollary of their blocking, they send out a few more for a while, which prevents you from accessing that content again. That's why if you try to search in Google, for example, for a banned keyword, you'll be blocked. If you try to search for something again, even if it would be normally an accessible keyword, it'll still appear like you're blocked. So that's why oftentimes there's errors when people are reporting what kind of keywords are blocked, because if you search in Google for a banned word, you get blocked. You hit your back button, your cached page of Google appears. You search again for an unblocked word, and it'll appear to be blocked. So you have to be really careful in trying to determine what they're exactly up to. So that's the broad range in general of the types of filtering that we're dealing with. And essentially what we do is we try to figure out what kinds of these filtering techniques each internet service provider is using. And then when we figure that out, then we run through the massive list, as Ron mentioned, where we try to determine what kind of content areas are being specifically targeted. And that's what Rob will tell you all about.